Hello, and welcome to the Dingometer, where we tackle tricky issues and learning design and explore the factors that produce awesome learning experiences. So, I'm delighted to be joined today by my esteemed Director of Learning Experiences, Phil Gomm. Welcome, Phil.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Tony, how are you today? All good?
I am good on this rainy February afternoon. Yes,
I
happy to
see
work
that
from home.
the plant rivalry is coming along nicely.
It's good. Yeah, my plants are sort of like just leaking across into your screen, which actually works quite well, doesn't it? It's almost like it was designed. All right, so this is the second in our series of episodes looking at different aspects of learning design. So, Phil, you've developed these 12 personas of learning design. In our previous episode, we looked at sense making as the first key thing that learning designers do way before any learning design happens. Often, when you get a brief or just an instruction or a potential brief, then the first thing is that you have to make sense of it. So, in the last episode, we looked at the role of the learning designer as sense making, and then once you've started to make sense of it, we start to get into building trust. And again, we're sort of still way before any learning happens, aren't we, at this point?
Well, yeah, I mean, obviously, sense making is, and again, trust building. All of these things can seem a little bit like, of course, because where would you be without those things? But just to recap, sense making, it was really about again, it's all about language and staying alive to language and ensuring that when you are agreeing on terms and you're sort of making sense of what a project is and what it isn't, that you're taking that time and you're pressing that pause button to make sure that everyone in the room has an agreed understanding of what you're talking about. Because it's amazing how if you don't have that agreement, or worse, if you think you have that agreement and you don't, that you then go forward and things get baked in, and then suddenly you're losing time and resources and goodwill, really, when a learning experience starts to kind of divert from its intended track, or when there are unintended consequences of language playing out in interesting ways. I mean, we could go on endlessly about sort of learning outcomes, assessment rubrics, that they really are the space where if you haven't got your language, if you haven't made sense of your language through like your course philosophy, or you haven't really got it sorted, that starts to get incredibly hard to do well, doesn't it? That the wordness of learning is key, and I think you see that play out. So yes, that's what we talked about last week, but this week, in this sort of range, this sort of peacock tail of personas, I thought we want to talk about the trust piece. And of course, trust building, instantly people think, well, that's about making sure that everyone can be psychologically safe, I don't know, in a meeting room, or that people feel able to disagree, or people feel able to sort of raise their hand. And I'm not going to say that's not what we're going to talk about. It's always part of it. But actually, I want to talk about something really that's born out of our commercial experience as learning designers. So it's not just like trust in this sort of general sense, it's trust in a very specific sense. And to tee that up, I wanted to ask you a question, Tony, which is simply this, which is that, so you're a learning designer, you are, you know, immersed in learning theory, learning is your thing, you're a learning nerd. Have you ever been surprised about how quickly the conversations that you have in sort of commercial learning spaces, where learning is almost like the first topic to stop being talked about? It's like how long has it taken your experience for the conversation to move away from learning, in your experience of sort of working in the learning product space?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, and my answer would be very often, because learning is the often the output of the sum total of the organizational activity. And it reminds me a lot of work I did many years ago in customer experience, where ultimately the customer is sort of is the end of this. It's the end. It's what happens at the end of all the organizational stuff, and then at some point the organization meets the customer, and it's the same thing. At some point, a learning product organization meets the learner, but that's like the very end expression of all this other stuff that's had to happen before you get there. And I think learning designers, in many ways, are across all of that distance. They are right at the end, understanding what the learner is going to feel like experiencing this product or experience or course or whatever it happens to be. And yet the learning designer also has to walk all the way back into the organization to understand all the decisions that have been taken that will influence the moment where that product meets the learner. And yet that just has to happen, that all has to happen for this to make sense. And so often learning designers are sort of down here trying to fix this, but they haven't had a chance to be involved in conversations up here where decisions were taken that fundamentally impact the learner experience. It might be about coach confidence or lack of coach training or course design or outcomes or all sorts of things where more more advocacy for the learner would have produced a better outcome, and yet often that's very downstream.
So, what would you say are the sorts of conversations that sort of push the learner out of the conversation? What are the sort of the sort of constraints do you what's your experience of where the concerns that the organisation has begin to kind of push learning and conversations about learning sort of to the margins? What are the things that organisations are often worrying about, really?
Compliance and budget. I would say,
I mean, you were straight on that like that.
yeah. I was
Yeah.
like, what are they? Yeah, I mean, it's compliance in terms of, and that doesn't mean sort of health and safety, organizational compliance. It can often just be in apprenticeships, we have to meet these learning outcomes. In higher education, we have to meet these criteria. And from a regulatory perspective, we have to make sure that's taken care of. So a lot of the airtime at the start of a project is around that mapping and making sure that things are going to get hit at certain points, but that very easily turns into, we need to deliver this content to meet these outcomes to produce that compliance, and the learner's still over there somewhere. So if you can fix that, you can say, well, there's probably a better way of doing that, that it's probably a bit softer and not just about content and compliance. And then it's like, well, how much is it going to cost? So then it's budget. So really, it's the compliance and budget sort of levers are the two things that are often always working against you when you're trying to advocate for the learner. But it's strange because it doesn't in any way mean that this experience over here has to be boring and expensive. It can be exciting and pretty efficient, to be honest, but it does involve asking the right questions early on in that build process.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of people might think that you and I spend a lot of time as sort of advocates for learning. By that I mean is that if you're a learning designer, you're just deploying your learning theory all the time, and you're sort of like engaging people in sort of like erudite conversations about the learning experience. And I've sort of my experience, my surprise, I suppose, is to discover how counterproductive that those conversations can be, because what they tend to do is they produce a kind of a siloing effect where you've got the organization and maybe you've got the curriculum, or you've got kind of like the client, or you've got sort of whatever sector wants to be served, and then you've got these people who turn up talking about learning. And strangely, you would expect that those conversations would draw people to you,
Mm.
but in fact they sort of make you feel like you've come in from some ivory tower. And this is the trust piece. And I wanted to talk about it today because we've got this like gold standard case study about this, and I actually think it's quite unusual because, and perhaps it will confuse listeners a little bit around trust, because you would expect the idea that sometimes you might meet a more corporate or compliant facing sort of client, and they're not interested in change. They're just interested in meeting the beats and sort of like monetizing the need for learning. And we had this really, I think, quite rare experience of meeting a client that understood one thing from the outset, and it understood that it had to do something differently.
Mm.
So I'm talking about sort of an ed tech company that we work with that was moving into an already highly saturated marketplace in terms of learning products, these kind of data boot camps. So it was already highly saturated, but also there was more to do in that space. And our relationship with them began simply because they wanted to do something differently. And I wanted to bring that up because even though they came with that very interesting question, I would say in terms of trust building, this was a classic example of what trust building actually looks like if you're interested in learning. And it actually has less to do with deploying the learning talk, right? So in that scenario, in this particular case study, we wanted to do something quite bold. They wanted us to do something quite bold, but they were also very, very nervous about it, and it was high risk. So, what are your memories of how we negotiated that kind of paradox, which is pro learning, pro change, pro reform, but also risk aversion and sort of worries around the market? What are your memories of the conversations and the kind of the tap dancing we had to do um, around those initial conversations about meeting their brief?
Yeah, it's really interesting, wasn't it? Because it's as you say, that doesn't happen very often when you get a client come to you that's got a budget and has got a mission to want to do something different, but not isn't quite sure how to get there, and yet they still need to know that what they're going to get is what they want, even though they don't really know what they want and how to ask for it. So I certainly remember those initial conversations with that client being around. More than trust, it was just showing that we could speak their language, really, and that we weren't just these sort of two people who were going to come in and build anything. So I guess, yeah, this is why it is trust, isn't it? It's we had to demonstrate that we could listen to them, that we weren't just going to pull an off-the-shelf solution out of the hat and do what we've always done. We had to walk into their language. We had to meet stakeholders across the business to know that to show that we were a safe pair of hands. We were asking the right questions, and all of that did involve us being, I would say, out of our comfort zone, but it certainly wasn't
I was out of my comfort zone. I'm just going to, I'm going to say that straight away. Yeah.
Yeah, but it wasn't so much conversations about learning, was it? It was showing that we understood their take on the sector context and that we could uh, contribute something meaningful to that, and that we had a solution that responded to that. But it all had to be just one step ahead of where they were, because if we sort of steamrolled in and said, oh, it could be this, it could be that, and then you've instantly lost the client. So there is this really sensitive thing that you have to do, I guess, in a lot of consultancy work, where you have to take the client with you. You might be able to see the solution straight away or have a really good idea of what will solve their problem, and yet if they don't trust you, then they're never going to let you take them there. So a lot of that was around language. It was spending time with subject matter experts. It was demonstrating that we had the capability to take some insight about this particular sector and sort of repackage it, play it back in such a way that it's like, you said this is what this might look like. How do you feel about it? So this idea of consensus building is super important, I think, in any kind of the early stages of any consultancy project. Again, probably beyond learning design, is that idea that you have to show people that you're non-threatening, that you do have their best interests at heart, and that you are confident in talking about your own expertise, but you're also confident to not overstep the mark in many ways and sort of like go in being overly confident. So, I mean, those were some of my early memories. What about you? I mean, you said you're out of your comfort zone, but I mean, it was like learn fast, wasn't it?
Well, it was sort of like this idea of it was because a lot of the conversations were about the market, and I think if you come from sort of a higher ed background, I mean, obviously now everyone is highly sensitized to the idea of marketization of education, etc., etc. But this was about, essentially, it was this basic thing, which is that it was a translation piece. So the way you built trust was talking about how your idea would solve a problem in their universe. It wasn't sort of that you've had a great idea. That's fine. You're paid to have great ideas, but it's like that you need to be able to understand how to give that idea away in such a way that it sort of solves a problem in their reality. So it's like not being confused by the differences between yourself and the client, but at the same time sort of being really aware of the differences, because then you're able to sort of position it in a different way. So I still remember a very early call where one of the we'd been brought in and we were there to talk about our idea, and the idea was that if they were serious about closing the employability gap, then they needed more experiences that simulated the worst practices or the imperfect spaces of the workplace. And so we would recognize that as scenario-based learning. And scenario-based learning is a subgenre of fiction. And so fiction feels like something that's got nothing to do with business realities, has got nothing to do with delivering on apprenticeship standards or anything else. It feels like it's sort of like a wacky idea. But if you tracked it back, the thing they were asking to fix was this notion that how were these sort of young people, these learners, these people who had left school or left university, how were they going to get better at some of the rough and tumble of the workplace? How are they going to sort of get better at meeting experiences that weren't freshly minted in terms of a project brief, that were a bit more sort of rough around the edges? And the answer, you and I looked at each other, and the obvious answer was to sort of move into sort of fiction and scenarios. And I still remember that early call where I think one of the finance guys was on the call, and I think that finance guy was on the call to say, "Who are these idiots?" It was like, sorry, we've got this budget, we've got this market target that we need to sort of like hit straight on, because it's like, there's a risk here. And you've got these two guys, these two muppets, talking about how if you want to do that, you might need to be thinking about sort of fictional workplaces. You might need to be thinking about actors. You might be thinking about kind of sort of scenario theatre. And I do remember those early calls where it seemed every word that I chose was a word that made the one guy on that call go further away from me. I sort of remember that all of the kind of, my little bright-eyed, bushy-tailed kind of like, yeah, we could do that. I could sort of feel a sort of a stepping back process. And yes, I mean, in the end, they did take a risk, and I think there was sort of some held breath for a lot of it. But I quickly realised, from a language point of view, that we sort of had to walk into their space, and so instead of talking about fictional scenario, we had to talk about, we're going to create some kind of sort of, I don't know, verifiable work experience. We're going to have to sort of like, so there's a swapping out of words, and that partly came from listening to the words they were using to describe their problem, and just then doing a little bit of kind of, I suppose, mosaicing, where sometimes you would deploy a bit of you, and often you would deploy a bit of them. And I think that was a trust building experience. It was like creating a composite knowledge between kind of like the learning languages and the market sort of financing and business languages. And I personally at times felt that uncomfortable, because I felt like I was giving something up or surrendering something. And then I sort of just realized that in the big dictionary of kind of how do you build trust, that something human and basic and ordinary was going on, which was essentially taking the time to create this language that you could go forward on, build trust, build rapport. And without that, I don't think we could have gone as far or as interestingly as we did in the end. I don't know what you think.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think it's, again, thinking back to those early meetings, and this is, I could say this for pretty much all the client meetings we've had since. When you have those initial meetings with any new client, everyone is posturing. And I guess it reminds me of those birds that kind of have to dance around each other and sort of like show off a little bit. So everyone's kind of dancing around. Everyone's got their ego out, but also knows that for this to work, everyone's got to drop their ego, and we've got to figure out a way forward. And we've talked in previous podcasts around the importance of personality and casting in course delivery, but there is also something here around personality in the learning design process at this point in the process, where you have to be confident in your ability to walk into this space that you don't necessarily understand, but you also have to be very meta and kind of like high emotional intelligence to not kind of like trounce all over it and like overclaim or all this. So this kind of this, you've got to quickly dance around each other, figure out who knows what, who doesn't know what, and then the trust building work can start once you've sort of achieved that sort of that tentative consensus at the start. And I think you had a project last year, a different apprenticeship project, where it was about holding two things in tension. It was like the client and the learner. And I think, again, when you're working with clients, the client will come to you with the business perspective, knowing that, or almost like hoping that you will be able to understand the business perspective and the learner perspective as well. And you've got to, you have to hold those two things together. You have to know that the client has specific constraints and budgetary requirements and compliance, but you also need them to trust that you will do a good job to engage their learners and not just build the thing that necessarily they've asked you to build. You've got to do both things, and that's quite a tricky job, I think.
I think if you think about what is the goal of trust building, you could say the goal of trust building is to ensure the project gets done. It's to build relationships with all those things. But I think the goal of trust building is to produce the conditions in which you can go on advocating for the learner, because the learner is never in the room, and
Exactly.
the learner is never in the meetings. The learner is the recipient. And I mean, you and I have absolutely seen examples of very well established learning products, experiences that have been running and going out there. And you and I might look at them and hold our noses a bit and just think, I can't believe that that was good enough at some point for a group of people who've gone through this experience. And I'm not sort of punching down there, because one assumes that that those expressions of learning um, were all they perhaps could be at that point. But it does feel like the advocacy for the learner walked out of the room at some point, and this sort of almost the other forces perhaps were more paramount in shaping. But it's I don't want to present it as a fight or as a tug of war, because if you get the trust piece right, as you just said, the implication is that, and often I think the clients don't know what you're doing exactly, but you're allowed to do it. It's like, can you just do that thing that you do? We can't quite ask for it, but we're going to ask you to do it again, because the effect it produced for the learners was positive, in terms of, like, module surveys or blah, 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 all the news is good, but we still don't quite know how to ask for it. I think that's because still the learning thing, as you said at the very beginning, the learning piece in a lot of learning um, sort of in companies that are in learning, they're in learning because they know that it's a market that isn't going anywhere, and they know it's a market where there's money to draw down on. I don't think I don't think that necessarily a lot of the people who have that idea and see the business opportunity are necessarily coming from a space um, of learning. They're coming from a space that learning needs to be fed, and we're going to do something about that. And then they bring in this kind of the learners to do it. And that's where you do get this slight weird paradox, which is that the learning designers are often downriver or brought in at the not the 11th hour. I mean, certainly instructional designers, where a whole thing has happened, and then this lump of stuff comes out, and then someone else build that out. And sometimes it does feel as if no one had a proper look at it at all. It's like there's not been a single overview that sort of, this thing came out of the machine, people built that went out to the learners, and it sort of goes round and round. And that does worry me a bit. And it's why certainly some of our, when we've been able to be there at the front of a project and build trust and advocate and sort of bake in some best practices upriver,
Mm.
there is an absolute link between the successes and the student feedback and the satisfactions, and at what point I think that we as learning designers have interacted with the cycle.
Yeah.
So I think that you could probably, there's a graph there about how early it starts and the a likelihood of the thing producing the results that the client was hoping for.
Yeah, totally. And I think, and very quickly, I think in a AI enabled world, it's even more important, because you can build the wrong thing really quickly now if you don't have those right conversations at the start. But I think I love those moments where you can sort of feel trust starting to happen, particularly in those early conversations with subject matter experts. And they happened recently when we were on a call with an SME, and you're there to scope out this thing, and then someone says, "Can I just talk candidly?" And you're like, great. Now we're getting to what actually matters. Or like, I'm just going to tell you what actually happens in the industry. And like, okay, it's good, because that's often a sign that they're like, okay, well, I get that you're here and you're a good listener. And now I'm going to tell you what I think we actually need. Maybe that isn't the thing that's written down on the brief or what you've been told. And that you start to think that, okay, they're starting to trust me now, and I can start to then push into that space a bit and try and pull a bit more information out of it, I think.
But I think that's the other thing I think about this, I don't know, this persona, is that I think if you are, and you might disagree with me here, but I think if you're ideologically driven by best practice in learning, if you are, I want to use ideological with a small I here. I don't want to sort of use it pejoratively. I just mean that you have purists, and purists perhaps who wouldn't go near some of these learning environments, because it's just never going to be good enough, or it's never going to be learner-centric enough because of all the constraints that we've already established. And I do think that some of the trust that you build is that you have to park your ideology you have to park it, because otherwise you come off as a constant critic of environments that aren't always talking about learning.
Yeah.
And I think if that's your expectation, you are going to find some of these spaces to be um, difficult to enjoy, or difficult to feel your own agency in. And I think I some of the trust goes in the other direction, because I no longer see slightly partial expressions of learning, or products that aren't quite ready. I no longer see it as a trust issue, like we can't trust this organization because they always do it this way, or this is sort of like, it's actually more, I've learned much more about that these are human expressions of often constraint and time, and people under huge pressure to, sometimes entire cohorts have been sold to before even a product's been designed. And so you've got these imperfect conditions. And I think trust is really important there. As you just said, sometimes that the trust is there when you just level, and you admit to what's going on, and you admit to the constraints. And I think at that point you can start to you can start to do the very best work. But I think it's hard to do great work if someone's hiding it from you, or people aren't being quite clear about the provenance of how a learning product got commissioned, or what the problems are. And I think that's, you talked about it already, about when someone says, can I speak candidly, and you realize that actually there's a bin fire over here, or there's some the other engine of this aeroplane has just fallen off into the sea. But you know what I mean? And I don't see that as being the enemy of trust. Like, I see that as being the beginning of something um, important. And it's like, and then you can do the work.
Yeah.
Because if you do some work and you never knew the engine had fallen off, you will overbuild, or you'll build some impossible dream, or you'll create the guarantee of iteration, or you'll build in obsolescence, or you'll do something because you trusted what you were shown, and or what somebody felt they couldn't show you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's a good analogy. I think you can build anything for a client without trust, and yeah, you'll build something at the end. But as you said, there's a very great chance you'll build the wrong thing, because that person or those people you've met with haven't been entirely honest with you about what problem you're trying to fix, or what problem they're trying to fix, and so yeah, it's a colossal waste of time and money. So I think, yeah, I mean, quite early on in our friendship, you explained that you were an arch pragmatist, and I think that's something that absolutely stands as a key aspect of learning design. Because again, you can build anything, right? We can build any product for you in any platform or whatever. But actually, if we can't get to a kind of a mutual understanding of what this thing needs to be and why, and what problems it's trying to solve, you will build the wrong thing. So I think one of the things that's been a useful learning experience to me in the last couple of years is, I think this came up in the last episode, rather than asking clients for what they want, is asking them for what they don't want. Because for me, that's a great way to start to help you get beyond your own ideology, because you could walk into any space and go, well, we could build this and it'd be amazing. And if it was all informed by this theory, it would look like this. And it's like, well, they don't want that. So tell us everything you don't want, and then I'll figure out where I can help you with that, and where the space is for the learner, and then what my role is in kind of taking all of those constraints and producing something that will work for the client and for the learner. But you kind of need to start with that they need to trust you enough to tell you all the things they don't want, and to know that you can respond meaningfully to that. I think.
I mean, I can think of another sort of expression of trust, which is sort of looks sort of counterintuitive. It's in how it's to do with the commercial realities. So an example of this is that when we did some work with another sort of a provider that sort of provides online courses, and they're a small provider, and the idea of coming to them with an idea for a short course on games design, for example, and this idea that that course could be designed in such a way that it is brilliant once, because you build it with like all the bells and whistles. It's got tons of kind of videos, it's really fancy, it's got all that kind of stuff, blah blah blah. And then as a learning designer, because you're not in delivery, you walk away. A learning designer is not delivering. A learning designer isn't sort of teaching. They basically they build the thing and they leave. And I think building something for somebody in a knowledge that you're going to leave them with it, there's a trust piece there, because if you were sort of if you just thought, well, okay, I'm going to do my very best work, build this amazing thing, and then you leave them, what you're leaving them with is the knowledge that they'll open this thing up, it will be great once, and then somebody somewhere is going to have to either stop teaching that course because it's no longer viable, because things have changed, or someone else is going to have to kind of rebuild it, or perhaps more cynically, you've done it that way, so you get called back the next year. So as a learning designer, you get another job to sort of fix it. I think one way, certainly with providers, particularly if those providers don't have huge budgets, is to do all of those conversations around how can the thing that is built serve you well for as long as possible. And you start designing dependencies out. So you start to have these conversations about their actual institutional reality. And I think that that's another, I wouldn't have known right away as a learning designer that I was going to have to do that work. But that's some of the work I'm most interested in. It's like, because it's like building something can be an imposition. I'm just reminded to tell you a quick story about a friend of mine who was diagnosed with a very serious illness because somebody wanted to cheer her up because of it. It was Christmas time. This someone from a very sort of good space, from a sort of like well-intentioned, ordered her an enormous Christmas tree. And this friend of mine had only just come out from hospital. And so the intention was, I'll tell you what this house needs. It needs this enormous evergreen Christmas tree. So this friend of mine came home, was feeling terribly unwell and sort of vulnerable. There was a knock at the door, and this like 8-foot enormous Christmas tree was set up. And that 8-foot Christmas tree sat in her hall as a undeployable asset, this extraordinary, amazing thing that was absolutely the Christmas tree of your dreams. It was absolutely the wrong thing, because it created all of this cognitive work and this massive kind of job sheet for the person who had received this thing. And I think about that sometimes about learning design, and you sort of build a thing and it can be absolutely right from a learning design point of view. It can have all the bells and whistles. It can sort of have, video content for engagement. It can have this, it can have that, blah, blah, blah. And then you actually think that actually what you've done is you've broken a trust piece there, because what you've given away is something that will backfire, will fall into obsolescence, and will become a kind of white elephant. And that's another weird expression of learning design, where you need to empathize with the shelf life of the thing you've built in the context of that institution being delivered by those people. And that is not a constructive alignment piece. That's a kind of I don't know. It's like thinking about this institution as a living, breathing reality, and you show respect for it, and you build trust with those people by not building everything that it could have been, by building the thing that will actually work over there. I don't know if you've had those similar experiences, but certainly that's another trust piece that I don't think is clear from the label of learning design in a way.
Yeah, very much so. And that's another example of something that clients often don't know how to ask for, because they're in a hurry, they've got time pressure, they've got cohort pressure, and they just need you to build this thing to fix it for this cohort. And all the time, you have to walk into that space going, I could do that, but I might just be building out a whole load of new problems that you're going to need to fix next year, which may be that they'll come back to you and give you more work. But I think, that you're right, that you can build irresponsibly, or you can build responsibly to remove dependency. And yeah, sometimes that does involve perhaps advocating or designing solutions that aren't as creative or whizzy or bells and whistlesy as they might be, but actually it's the better long-term solution, because you're trying to mitigate organizational entropy in a way.
That's exactly right. That entropy was the word I was, I think, reaching for. That learning design is a funny thing, because you're often building quite substantial things. But I know from my sort of HE life that not a year went by when you weren't tweaking a brief or you weren't changing something. And I think that that learning design is this weird thing because you sort of build, you're making things out of plaster of Paris. Or you can do, you can sort of make kind of these fixed things.
Mm.
And I just know, again, in terms of usefulness, that that can get very unuseful, even though it is exactly right. It's what people ask for. It's sort of like you've just built a kind of a room that no one walks in.
You have
No,
a room full of plaster of Paris things that you can't get it anymore. Yeah.
exactly, exactly. So again, I would say you are still building trust to advocate for the learner, because obviously if that experience becomes unworkable or undoable, usually those courses are killed off, aren't they? And or that the learner won't be able to access that thing anymore because, or in terms of the game design one, I know that there was originally a curricula that was full of third-party videos, which were around different things. And I think the quality of those third-party videos, this idea of people deciding, when people decide to do a course, um, they're often spending money on it for sure, but they're also offering up their hope and their dreams to this experience. And to sort of know that they're going to walk into a slightly not fit for purpose space and decide that online learning, for example, or that type of learning is naff because the thing didn't work. I think I don't know about you, but that's the other trust relationship I have, which is when people learn, even if we're building courses where we don't understand that subject at all, I do remember vividly what it feels like to decide to learn something new. I
Mm.
can still remember what it's like to sort of to put your, I don't know, put your chips on that color and say, I'm going to throw my hand in, I'm going to sort of learn today. And I think that in that respect, that we owe it. That's why we have to be learner advocates all the time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's it. Like as you said, it's often always the learner is not in the room in those conversations. They might not be in the room for another year or so. Sometimes when you're building some of this stuff, so it's if the learning designer isn't advocating for the learner, then no one else is going to. And I think this sort of gets into perhaps it's the broader consultative aspect of learning design. As you said earlier, it can be both sort of downriver and upriver. Downriver, it is building stuff, like pragmatically building stuff, making things work, building slide decks, building async content, all that kind of stuff. But upriver is highly consultative, and it brings in all of those things that consultants have to do around advocacy and trust building. And it does then, done well, unlock future work. And I think this idea of trust is often associated with experimentation. It's like, yeah, if you trust, we can experiment, and that's all like, oh, we can build some cool stuff. And often, in our experience, I think certainly experimentation isn't that. What you're earning through trust building is the right to solve future problems.
Mm,
It's not like, hey, the trust that you can build whatever you like. It's no, we trust you enough to come to you now with a problem that sometimes we as the client don't even understand how to
mm.
fix, but we know you fixed the other one, and now we trust you to fix this one. So you're constantly earning the right through trust to take on less and less well-defined projects often.
That's right. That is right. So I think, if it's like a weird, like Holy Trinity that sort of um, to advocate for the learner is to, I think, in a consultative way, very clearly um, listen to the language of the sector, to sort of figure out what it's actually saying, and then it is not to impose learning into that sector. It is have the confidence to know that that will happen. But I think if you lean into the language of learning too early, I do think I've seen it happen. You will scare people away because and again, we could get into this on a much longer debate, but I think that there is something anti-business about learning.
Mm.
What I mean by that is that the two camps hear each other and go, "Oh no, I don't." So if you go in like learning and it's all about this, what people are hearing is that's slowing down the timeline, or that's not going to deliver what we need, or blah blah blah. And so things end up people end up sort of jumping apart, don't they? And I've seen that happen certainly in the early days a lot, and often been responsible for it, where you've kind of marched in thinking that your words are the magic words,
Yeah.
and you realize that your magic words just disappeared some rapport or spent some currency with that client like that, and you just weren't expecting that. You thought that everyone thinks that this idea that the learner is X or that you need to do Y is like fascinating, and you realize that these people have just walked away from you. But that's not the same as agreeing with them. It's because it's to suggest that they are somehow anti the thing they've asked for. It's just these two forces often doing that, right? These two forces. So, but if you build that out, there's this lovely sweet spot where suddenly, as you rightly say, that suddenly the conversations are about learning again, because they're about we've got this problem we can't solve, and that problem will live in the province of humans wanting to get information in a particular way. This isn't working, or this is subtle, or they need to deal with something more psychological, or they need to deal with something to do with employability. And you think, actually, they're talking about a specific and quite rich and quite exciting learning problem.
Mm.
But the thing is to know when to sort of consolidate that as a concept and give it back to them, and then how you can just sort of keep it on the low for long enough until you can't scare the horses anymore. And I think it's just trying not to be ideologically triggered or ideologically opposed to sectors that aren't interested in learning, though are in the business of learning. And I think it's sort of, you've got to calm it all down to a degree. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, completely. And yeah. So this is sort of getting into a much bigger conversation around what the role of the learning designer is. But it is that, and it takes me back to that image that you produced for that project last year around I think it was design construction management or something like that. And you had this kind of this impossible role. It was like a Greek tragedy where like Atlas has to push the things.
Yeah, like it's the holding. It's you're holding the two things.
Well, there's the two threads, and you've got this is the organisation, and it has its particular needs and demands, and you've got the learner, and often those things are miles apart.
Miles
And
apart.
you literally have to do that all the time. And sometimes it's like that, and if you can get it to there, that's a good thing. But you have to remember why these learners are going to, or not why, you're going to have to remember how these learners are going to feel when they experience this stuff that the organisation's produced, and do as much as you can to retain that feeling of excitement and not just build something really boring just because the organization wants that. So that's where you're constantly like in tension, just going, I know I've got to satisfy these people, but these are the people who've got to experience it. And this is the kind of the customer experience role again. It's like you're looking out, it's the Janus face, you're looking outwards to the learner,
Yeah.
inwards to the organization, and often you're the only person doing that.
Yeah, you are, because if you're not doing it, if you're looking at either one direction for too long, you are going to be delivering the wrong thing. So if you're looking only at the learner, people might think that the only way to get this job to sort of like release that tension is to consolidate the learner as the sort of the principal sort of stakeholder, whatever you want to say, the person who's got like skin in the game. But I think if you do that, you would build castles in the air, and you would also bring learning. You'd make learning go further away from where it needs to be. Sometimes it's like it's a weird thing. It's like two magnets, isn't it? And I do think that if you've got those two magnets, to hold two magnets that want to repel together is an ongoing feeling, isn't it? You have to like, but it's what makes the work interesting, because it sort of feels like that you have the opportunity to produce an effect in the learning imagination of somebody else. And as long as that's happening, the person who's commissioned the work will be a strong advocate of learning. They'll be like, yes, of course, of course. It's like, well, scenario-based learning is the classic, because scenario-based learning, as soon as you actually talk about it at any length, it seems like the weirdest, wackiest, hardest thing to do. And yet most of the conversations we have had around problems that particularly commercial sectors want to solve, to me, running my flag up the mast, they're all talking about that space. They're all talking about the power of simulation, the power of fiction, the power of getting people to live in a world that's not the classroom, and to sort of meet it's like relational knowledge impacting with the real world, all of that kind of stuff. And yet, from a trust point of view, advocating for scenario-based learning As we know, sort of within existing structures of education, it's high risk because people just think, what? And I think in sort of commercial sectors where, particularly if they're all about the workplace, the real workplace, and their raison d'etre is getting people ready for reality, there's a risk there in people getting confused with what we mean by scenario-based learning. And yet, the work we're doing with a client right now, you certainly over, scenario-based learning is written through it like a stick of rock.
Hmm.
But I am assuming you haven't had lots of interesting TED Talk moments on Zoom calls with that client talking about scenario-based learning, right?
No,
I'm
absolutely.
assuming you've just said, well, what we need to do is to produce the conditions where the KSBs are being operationalized so you meet the government standards,
Mhm.
and don't worry, but we know a way to do that, right? Something like that.
Yeah, and yeah, the scenario part there is basically the bit that's like, and how do you want the learners to feel? Like we've given all the stuff that meets all these criteria. How do you actually want your learners to feel, and how do you know this is going to make any sense to them at all? And yeah, that bit often isn't asked for, and it's the bit where, as the learning designer, you get to do your kind of like slightly magic bit, and they're like, yeah, we don't know what you've done, but that's kind of what we meant.
What I like is all the different ways people say. I've been on a few calls now where different clients, and I've sort of heard and so we've got this problem, and can you do and there'll be different words. Can you do like the fake people bit, or can you do
Yeah,
sort of the sort of the characters one, or the can you do the personas piece? Can you do the bit where you make stuff up,
yeah,
but you do it really really well? It's like
yeah. We can do that bit. That's fine.
So I think, but that's and to bring it all the way back, before we close, bring it back to that sort of case study, the gold standard when it comes to trust building. It really was an instance where we had that rare opportunity of the innovation was in the first request, the innovation, the space. And I certainly know that we learned a lot there about if you build trust, if you listen hard enough and then you translate a bit and then you create this kind of, I don't know, this kind of hybrid language that you and your client will then use, and you find what they want to call it, the thing that you find out what and then you start to use their expression of it, you can be given license
Yeah.
to go a very long way and do a lot of big swings.
Mhm.
That was a big swing. I still remember turning up the clapperboard and the film crew, and still watching sort of like some of the people going, "What are we doing?" But then I remember the phone call we got from the founder after the first cohort had gone through, and that he was ecstatic because he was in a room with students who were talking about the scenario. And bear in mind, all the scenario was the answer to the question about how can a educational environment do more around mimicking, mirroring, bringing in the workplace. So it's not like that idea was theirs. That idea was the client's. The execution of that was came from us. But that phone call, when this big swing, suddenly you realise that big swing was living in that person's head as an inevitable um, maneuver, as something that they wanted more of, as something that had produced an effect in learners in a way they'd never seen before. I
Mhm.
mean, it was a big swing,
Yeah.
but and it's sort of given us the ability, I think, to be trusted by other people in other sectors to kind of do a bit more of that kind of very interesting, responsive work, really.
Yeah, I think you're right. Just you say just before we close, you mentioned a really interesting word there, which is inevitable. And I think it's whether that's a film or a documentary or a piece of learning content. I think the client is often looking for that inevitability, but they don't know how to ask for it because they don't know what it looks like. Because at that moment, it's often not been decided, and that's a big ask for the learning designer. It's like we just want it to be right. We want when the learners experience this, we just want it to feel like it's supposed to feel, but we don't know what that looks like, and they're putting that trust in you to deliver on that, and that's where often the magic has to happen because they can only get so far in terms of producing documents and alignments and things. And at some point, they have to hand it over and go, can you make this just work for these people. So when they meet it, it feels like it's inevitable. And that's, that's no small task, really.
No small task.
So
So
trust, so we've looked at sense making and trust building. In our next episode, we're looking at the cultivator. So,
so and that's sort of the last in kind of the foundation stages, because obviously at some point, learning design does get into the business of building.
actually making things.
It gets into the business of making things. But I'm telling you now that making things in the absence of these stages is miserable. And to give you a painting and decorating analogy, if I may, to end, it's not the most exciting, but I think if you start to get into building learning experiences without some of this stuff being sorted, without these other personas having been in place, I think it's the equivalent of painting gloss paint on flaky plaster, or it is painting wood that's got rising damp. It's when you know that whatever you're doing, however good it may look, however much the performance of expertise is being undertaken, that it will not last, it will not hold, and you're baking in entropy, and you are basically hemorrhaging trust. Because the client, for example, if you don't ask those questions, if you don't sense make, and if you don't trust build, the client will just assume, if you don't surface all of that stuff, the client will assume the problem lives in the build, as opposed to it lives in your expertise. That's the problem. You've got
the thing they gave you is it's like it's your fault. Why did this break?
Fault. You've got to do this work, and often this work can make you as I think, as we've said, there's a social cost to it, because sometimes you have to be the idiot in the room. You have to ask people to repeat themselves. You have to be prepared to admit to have not understood something the first time. You just have to go through a series of kind of, I think, quite humble maneuvers, but without ever mistaking the fact that it's not really a humble maneuver. It's a consultant's maneuver.
Yes,
and if you're fully confident, you won't come off as interrogative. You will literally just come off as an outsider with the right and responsibility to ask those questions. And I think that certainly this persona and the last persona, they're a questions-based interaction, really.
Yeah. Out of that, trust will hopefully emerge. So.
Indeed. And then an extraordinary learning experience.
Yes, somewhere over there.
Hopefully not an enormous Christmas tree that you don't know what to do with,
Hopefully not an enormous Christmas tree. Yes, we'll try and minimise the chances of delivering one of those.
Yeah, exactly. You've given me what?
What? I've got to do what?
I've got to do what now? I've got nowhere to put this Christmas tree. I've got nowhere to put it, Yeah, so, yeah. Okay.
Good stuff. Okay, so tune in to our next episode to look at the cultivator in our series of things that learning designers do that you would never have thought they got involved in.
Absolutely.